what happens is we think then sustainability is sustainability is a goal that once achieved, we can move on to something else. Whereas I think, similar to what we had in, Viktor Frankl's book, it's bigger than that. It's got to continue. It's a normative term that will not be in many ways exactly achieved.
Welcome to Sustainability Transformations podcast, where we explore bold ideas to drive positive change for people, community, and business. And today's guest is David Auge, who is a sustainability educator, an environmental engineer, author using the wisdom of nature, especially around bees and locusts, to transform how we understand sustainable societies. And the goal of this podcast is exploring how nature is a teacher and balancing the order and chaos in how we build future societies, providing that fresh philosophical take on resilience and environmental adaptation. David, thank you so much for joining us. What sparked your fascination around insect societies as models for human sustainability? And can you introduce yourself, please?
Well, Enoch, thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I do appreciate that. The background that you mentioned is I've spent decades as an environmental engineer within industry and have had a chance through that and the sustainability initiatives to bring to the surface, hopefully through this book, a way to better communicate to the next generation what we're dealing with when we search for the word sustainability, and we put more than just a word before us, a struggle that each one of us has as we find ourselves in this particular profession.
That's great. Clearly, your book title echoes Victor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. How does your work build on those ideas in the context of environmental sustainability?
Enoch, are you familiar with who Victor Frankl was?
Briefly, and all I'm familiar with was he was in some form of jail. I'm trying to remember the specific type of that bad jail in which he was and how he had positive mindset. But that's a brief appreciation of he was. But perhaps you can help me and the audience on that.
Sure. Well, Viktor Frankl was an Austrian neurologist and psychologist who founded what he called the field of logotherapy. It's been dubbed the third Viennese school of psychology following Freud and Adler. Now, logotherapy was developed in and through Frankl's personal experience in the Theresienstadt Nazi concentration camps during World War II. You see, Frankl spent a total of 3 years in 4 different camps, Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Kaufering, and Turkheim. He lost his father in the Terezin ghetto, his brother and mother at Auschwitz, his wife at Bergen-Belsen, and his sister Stella was able to escape to Australia. What he brought through and what he was able to communicate in a book called Man's Search for Meaning was his experiences in those camps working in the infirmary. He was a psychologist and thus identified as a doctor. And he had a chance to see the last section of these individuals' lives who were being at that time exterminated for the fact that the Nazi regime didn't want them there any longer. And in that particular event, he discovered that they had a purpose for seeing one more day. They had a reason to sustain their lives, to see another day dawn, even though everything around them wanted them dead. And what he uncovered, and he kind of brings to the surface in the book he wrote, is that there were 3 rational reasons, at least that were communicated to him by these individuals. One was that they had a person they needed to see. They were going to maintain their life because there was someone else alive on this planet who they needed to touch again before life here ended. The second one was that they had something that was on their heart to perform, whether they're like a composer and they had a piece to write, or a poet and they had a poem to compose, but there was something inside of them they felt just hadn't been communicated to the remainder of society at that time. And the third one, where he spends a lot of his book just delving into, was that there was a bigger reason for their existence than just this. There was something in them that they felt like there was a bigger story than that story that just existed in their being in that concentration camp, in their existence in that infirmary, in their heart or whatever part of their body failing at that time. and there was some delving into the meaning of it all. And thus came the book Man's Search for Meaning. And in many ways, meaning has to deal with a lot of sustainability as well. See, sustainability is, what do we want to sustain? What is our expectations for the future generations to inherit? If we don't have that expectations, that knowledge, that right knowledge, if you would, of where we're going, then we kind of continue to fluster along the way, shooting in the dark. So we have to come back to that grasping of the very concept of sustainability.
That's a powerful book. I mean, I've heard it being quoted a few times, but it's good to know that it wasn't just him observing other people as part of the work, giving that key concept. So, why is this the right moment within our history or the human history to rethink sustainability from the ground up, would you say?
Well, you probably note in the book, I mentioned this concept of mimesis and poesis, about looking at the world that's around us. Mimesis and poesis are two separate ways of developing a worldview. A mimetic view regards the world as having a given order, a given meaning, and thus sees human beings as required to discover what that meaning is and then conform themselves to it. Poesis, by way of contrast, sees the world as just so much raw material out of which meaning and purpose can be created by the individual. Perhaps the easiest way for most of perhaps your listeners to grasp is that a mimetic view would look at things more in a qualitative aspect from sustainability. What's the quality of what we're looking at? A poetic view would look more at a quantitative way. And as you can see in our current societies, especially with sustainability, we want a number. We want some confined metric upon which we can measure success or failure. Now, in the short term, or managing by that number, and I as an engineer do so in so many different realms, you get a measurable success of where you're going and if you've got there or not. But for sustainability, I think it misses that aspect that a mimetic viewpoint would provide us. And that's the reason for such a book as I've written. I want people to see two particular communities that are out there, the honeybee and the desert locust, and see that you can learn from both of them, not just cast them aside as irrelevant types of ideas, but to bring them to the fore so that the discussion has a greater depth than just a number that we, in many ways, think sustainability is.
Honeybees and locusts, what's the difference between the two and how they approach survival?
Okay. Well, one of the things you have to know is that they both want to survive, just like the human race does. So one approaches it in a very organized, systematic fashion. The honeybee. I'm a beekeeper, so right now I've got two beehives in my yard that I routinely visit. I routinely interact with, working with the queen and the workers and making sure that the production of honey, the pollination efforts are successful. Their efforts are usually seen by society as just the preeminent and most respected way upon which to organize an effort for the massive production of honey that they give us, and also the pollination. They're in the United States, they're on state flags. Their honeybee is not native to the United States, but it is the state insect in almost half of the states here because it's got such a wonderful reputation for showing us an organized approach to life and production. In contrast to that, the most hated of insects, and that's what I mentioned, the most loved and the most hated, is the desert locust. And Enoch, you were in Africa, so you are perhaps more aware than most that if a desert locust shows up on the horizon, your future, your community's future, is in peril. That future desire to be a sustainable community is now in shock because of what it faces. But that's looking at it from a human perspective. For the desert locust, there's a community there, a community that can number into the millions and billions. And you're probably going to ask me about the largest of those communities, even into the trillions. And because of that, there's a certain dynamic of that particular community, looking at it from a community itself, that I think we can glean information from. And that's what I'm attempting to do. Give those that read the book a story that they can contrast. There's good things about the community of honeybees, and there's good things about the community of desert locusts. And in contrast, there's also bad things about those two communities, some parts of which we as humans, from a mimetic point of view, could learn from.
Now, that's good. So you described the bees as ordered, but the locusts are chaotic, and both are sustainable in their own right. How can that be?
How can it be that they're both sustainable in their own unique way? Well,
And
first you have to understand is
yeah,
a definition of sustainability. And let's go back to a mimetic point of view. Sustainability is more of a normative term. And many of your listeners may say, oh, he's off in left field now. But I see it as this way. It's normative in that the fact that when it was first told, there was three intersections: social, economic, and
environment.
environment. And the three circles, as they were usually explained, had a point of intersection. And the larger that point of intersection of those three grew, the more sustainable you were. It was explained many times in that particular vein, and that section in the midst of it was better if it was larger. It was more normative, almost like more beautiful, more accepting, more arriving at what we want to get to. I found that as a qualitative approach to kind of explain the concept. But as we moved forward, we turned it into a number. And that number started to lose the fact that there are certain strengths that each of them have. So let's go to the desert locust, which most people say, oh, that's not sustainable. Well, it's not sustainable for us on the receiving end as they go and proceed through whatever town or community or country that they've found themselves in. But for themselves, it is. Now, a desert locust, let's go back. A desert locust is a collection of about 10 different species of what most people would identify as a grasshopper. Those particular species, upon being placed in an environment where for a short period of time there's an abundance of resources, those resources then go away. And these desert locusts, which at the time appear a lot like grasshoppers, begin to have closer contact. Their color changes, their brain sizes change. They go through a phase change, which actually changes their very characteristic from being a very solitary to a very gregarious type of insect. Now, this insect then grows in number. Because they're closer, their reproduction increases dramatically. The swarm, as they start to collect, as they do so, has now a greater capacity within their brains. They change the amount of time that they're together. It's now if they're going to fly at daytime, at nighttime, and they're going to move in a mass. They're usually called in ranks when they're on the ground in the fourth, not the fifth east star as they're proceeding, to consume pretty much everything in sight. It took the United Nations in the 90s, an international collection of experts, in order to quell what a desert locust swarm was going to do. And that particular effort of what they were going to do was consume everything they wanted in sight. Desert locusts would go through phases. They would be very sustainable because in having achieved their own desire, they had been able to handle the stress of the environment through that. Now, what do we gain from that? Well, in many ways, we as humans have a certain propensity to be like that in our own degree of moving from rural to urban environments, from going from a resource minimalist type of approach to a much more greater desire for the resources that we have out there. They have, that is the desert locust, succeeded to the point it took international efforts to constrain them. Similarly, if you got a city, it's very hard to see a city as being sustainable because of the requirement of outside resources to keep it going. To itself show that parallel. So that's the sustainable effort that they have, because once again, it took external resources to control them. But they also give us that example of the strength that they had, tremendous strength for being able to make decisions in the chaos of that particular collection. There's not a king within or a ruler within the movement of a locust swarm. They actually move forward based upon a collection of social networking within the group, looking for what many times, and I think I point this out in the book, the opportunity to fly and to understand the collection desire to go downwind. That strength of the desert locust allows them as a community to continue to grow, deal with stressors, deal with tasks and the like. Now let's jump over the fence to the most respected of those insect communities. Bees don't handle stress very well. It's actually to the advantage of the desert locust to actually deal with stress. But in contrast, bees have to manage the environment closely. There's all females. A hive will have a queen. She's a female. The workers are all females. Drones make up less than 1/10 of 1% of the population. It's structured in the work that they do. A regular worker bee will live for 6 weeks. A queen will live usually between 1 to 5 years. The element of work that those worker bees will proceed through, based upon who you're talking to, it could be described as between 4 to as many as 7 or 10 different jobs. They will become, as they mature, much more protective of the hive. Even the last part, where the last job given to them, where they're a guard or they're a forager, is very protective of the outside of the hive. Those elements allow the hive to sustain. And then after it's got to a point of too large of a collection of bees within a hive, they'll swarm. They'll actually move out and create 2 additional swarms with a high probability, usually 60 to 70% of success, as they go from that one hive to the 2. So you're learning, hopefully, from the contrast of these two, their strengths, perhaps even their weaknesses. As you can see, the lack of structure sometimes is seen as a fallback on the locust. The lack of structure that bees have is a strength. But you're seeing that perhaps we can glean something and use stories about them to help us understand ourselves, how we can get to that point in a qualitative, not a quantitative way.
Yeah, so you've described areas around the work, but I'm curious to know how they manage decision making, what humans or human systems can learn from their decision making processes.
Okay, so how they make decisions. Let's look first at the bees. The bees have a structure that's very, very autocratic, or it appears to be that way, in the fact that there's a queen whose pheromones communicate the health of the hive, her health, the need for certain action. But there's also, in that autocratic format that the bees have, a key decision about whether to become 2 hives. So let's go into that one. When the beehive that's currently occupied with 30 to 50,000 bees and seems to be growing and it's springtime, there's most likely a decision that, this space just isn't enough for all of us. And a decision needs to be made as to where do we go next. Now, what will happen is that group will maneuver, taking about 30% of the worker bees. I'm sorry, leaving 30% of the worker bees, taking about 60%, and they will fly away from the hive and congregate on a branch or a tree of some sort, maybe a building, and within 24 to 78 hours, go through a decision-making process of how best to locate the next home. So here's the decision. They as a group have to have left behind new queens and have taken the old queen plus approximately 60% of the existing workers to a location where they will make a decision. So how do they make that decision? Some of your listeners may be aware that there is a communication effort within the hive where the bees actually, with a figure 8 or a circle, can tell the location of nectar, pollen. These particular dances indicate the direction and the distance from the hive of where they're. Well, that's good for foraging. That's good for the collection of food. But when they have to maneuver, they'll go to this ball, this swarm on the side of a building or in a branch, and they'll do the same thing on the outside of that ball of bees. The foragers will become scouts. They will go out and then they will come back with the location of a new home. They're looking for something approximately 15 feet in the air, southern facing. It's got to be relatively dry. It would have been nice if it was occupied by bees previously, leaving a certain amount of wax inside of it. They'll come back and they will do a dance on the outside of that ball of bees for the next 24 to 72 hours. That dance will communicate, because of its intensity, the belief that that particular bee has in what they found. It'll prompt some additional bees to go and check it out, who then will come back. Now, at this time, you got the queen in the center. She is not making the decision. The democracy of the bees actually are doing so. They, in turn, will, with the intensity of the dance, usually during that period of time, come down to just 1 or 2 different options. And when the majority, a quorum of the bees have said, yep, this is the place we need to go, they will move as an entire swarm, 30,000 or so bees, to that new location. Having made the decision with the queen in the center as to the best location based upon input from input from the workers, who then convince the rest of where to go. That's something we can learn from. Actually, there is a collection of town meetings, perhaps in Ghana. I know that they had them in the New England states, where town meetings required the population of the entire town to be present, or as best as they could get there, and a collection of decisions being made by everybody. It's almost like there wasn't a parliament or a Congress. They were representative of all. And then those individuals with information would speak and a decision would be made. We can learn from that. And many people have. One of the reasons why people respect the honeybees is not because of that, but because they see the order upon which so many of these things are made. So there's a decision we can learn from. There's a qualitative effort of something being sustainable that would show participation from that insect group that we can even glean and grow.
Yeah.
Well, now the desert locust. Do you want me to go through that one as what we could glean from
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay, so now you got the desert locusts. They don't have a queen. They don't have anybody who's saying, hey, time to split up. They actually have no leader whatsoever. But as a result, there's no problem. Their decisions about what to do and how to move are somewhat more nomadic. The locust produces um, uh, a population that has a continual desire to find the next place to live, and many times the next place to consume. Now, you can say, how does that have to be dealing with sustainability? Well, there is a tremendous appetite in those locusts. And even though we are trying to be minimalist and in so many different ways, the energy demanded by those resources around us seems to grow and grow and grow. Uh, AI resources for the data centers that are being put into place show a tremendous increase on the demand that our entire society has to deal with. So that's the parallel perhaps there. So how do they make decisions upon the fact that they don't have a leader? There's this continual seeking for the center that happens within a locust swarm. Many times when they are in an area upon which they have just consumed and are consuming pretty much all the vegetation in sight, they have to find the next location upon which to go. The seeking for the center is that within that group of locusts, which could be hundreds of thousands or millions, there is a sense of collective intelligence upon which they're going to find the next home. And that seeking for the center knows that somewhere in the center, there's the answer we're seeking, the place to go downwind, the new home with the resources which are available to us. We too, as humans, have a certain opportunity to grow because of a consensus like the internet provides us of a collection of information we haven't had a chance to access in the past. And accessing that, just like the locusts do, gives us as humans a strength that in many ways we've lacked or at least failed to understand its benefit to us.
Oh, that's
So two
good.
different approaches, making decisions.
Great insight around what humans, systems, governments, leadership, groups, teams can learn from that. So, is our culture biased towards order and control preventing us from learning from these adaptive systems like locusts?
So the question is, what are we lacking to gain the lessons that are before us?
Yes.
Perhaps it's a propensity that I see to search for a number, to somehow turn what's a qualitative lesson to be learned into a quantitative effort to be measured. And the quantitative effort to be measured sure sounds like a good way to keep this thing in order. What happens is we think then sustainability is a goal that once achieved, we can move on to something else. Whereas I think, similar to what we had in, Viktor Frankl's book, it's bigger than that. It's got to continue. It's a normative term that will not be in many ways exactly achieved. One thing, as you probably already had leaders talk about, is that the management of expectations is what we're concerned about with sustainability. If the only thing necessary for me to feel comfortable with my water resources would be to have a water well within a short distance of where I live, and you gave it to me there and it was fine, I'd be fine. But there are expectations within the United States and there in Great Britain that the water quality be relatively high, that the availability of water that's been gone through an RO system or is made available to us at all times in every location. That's why we're no longer drinking as much from the faucet and we've got to have bottled water at our resource. Our expectation has grown. That's something, understanding sustainability, understanding it's linked to expectations, is going to make this continue all the way into the future and not something where we can say, well, we got the point. We got that number done. No, expectations have just moved. The goalposts have changed. The playing field we're on is different than it was 10 years ago. Looking at it from a mimetic and qualitative standpoint is something that I think is lacking in our.
Yeah. So, Do you believe we are headed for catastrophe, or is there a hope that humanity can still adapt?
Good question. Do I believe that that there's some catastrophic failure of the entire system supporting humanity in the offing? I'm not a prognosticator. I wrote the book not to do that speculation because there are so many out there who start off the entire argument with a fear-mongering effort and thus shut down about half of those that need to participate in whatever happens in the future. A lot of and a critical effort at being able to achieve any sustainability success is participation. And if we start off by already finding ways to poo-poo about half of the population that's coming forward, we'll go nowhere. So I'm not a prognosticator. I daily address local, state, national, international requirements, to address regulations that hope to curtail a catastrophe. But if I spend a lot of time, and I don't do so in the book, but if I spend a lot of time trying to paint a picture of catastrophe, I don't think it brings in the participation we want. We've got to find something more amenable to bring those participants to that point of understanding expectations and understanding sustainability as a normative.
A speaker told me recently that the biochemistry part of humans, where when humans are experiencing fear, the part of the brain that makes them think shuts down out of curiosity, of why it shouldn't be, or the doomsaying aspect of sustainability, where if you just use fear mongering, that fear shuts down people's ability to even think about why they have to be more sustainable, because that is the natural instinct. That part of the brain is shut. So I'm curious to know if you've heard about that or supports the idea of climate alarmism. Level of fear doesn't help people to decision makers to come on board. Right. So next question: what is Albert Swarm and why does it matter for our future?
Well, it's a story. Albert's swarm. Okay, good. And this is something an American audience is almost unaware of. You think of locusts, and most people will go back to the Bible and say, "Oh, that was the eighth plague." We remember that going across the country of Egypt and being something that just totally decimated the country near the very end of those 10 plagues that are described. But the largest plague, at least largest plague in recorded history that we have, occurred in the United States. And most people say, locust swarms in the United States? You've got to be kidding. We don't have locusts here. They're in the Sahara Desert. They're in the northern portion of Africa, in Asia. There's one that's happening right now in Australia. But the United States, that's where Albert's swarm comes into play. It also shows us a lack of understanding, if you would, of our own history. So let me tell you about Albert's swarm. It had to deal with something called the Rocky Mountain locusts. The Rocky Mountain locusts are currently extinct. They're not on the planet any longer. But Albert's swarm had to deal with a guy named Albert Childs. Now, Albert Child was a medical doctor who served as a doctor and also a meteorologist in the Civil War in the United States. In 1875, he was located in Nebraska. And as a meteorologist, he was connected with the information that he gathered to the Smithsonian Institute, where he would provide on a routine basis what the weather was, particular phenomenon in the state of Nebraska, which is in the central portion of the United States, was occurring. Well, in 1875, from June 15th to the 25th, he observed a swarm of locusts 110 miles wide, moving overhead of the state. He had the instrumentation necessary to be able to see the swarm and the density of these bugs, if you want to, these locusts flying overhead, and that the flight took place for a period of 10 days. He also, with the instrument, was able to show that it was a mile thick, a mile deep, and that the swarms were flying with the wind at about a 10-mile-per-hour rate. The wind was about 10 miles. The locusts were flying at about 15 miles. Because of the area covered and the instruments that he had, he noted that the entire amount of coverage just through the air, just through the flying of these locusts, Rocky Mountain locusts, was 198,000 square miles. That swarm covered the entire area of Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Vermont. That 3.5 million locusts were in the air at that time that he covered. This particular group actually descended upon the states of Iowa, portions of Missouri, a portion of Illinois, and the states declared national emergencies. The national emergency, in some cases, required the individuals to show up, that is, every citizen in those states, show up for work of killing and removing the locusts and removing whatever was at the end of their flight and the destruction of the land as possible. There were people starving. Tremendous amounts of military stores had to be opened up to accommodate the individuals who were dying because of no food whatsoever. The locusts were burned. They tried every which way they possibly could to figure out how they could stem this tide. One of the things they found is that the locust actually would put into the ground their future progeny down to about 6 inches. So they started to plow to 9 inches. That plowing was able to turn that around. But that entire effort, that entire monstrous swarm, which appeared to make the middle portion of the United States almost uninhabitable, it was less than 150 years ago. And we almost don't even know it occurred, because in many ways we have lost the qualitative measure of looking at things and growing from it. It was making that portion of the United States uninhabitable. And in many cases, it was addressing this particular insect and how to do it that the United States learned from. There's monuments in certain state houses. There's some books about it. But for the most part, we've forgotten, because we look at things from a poetic point of view. We put a number and we think this is just a bunch of raw materials and we'll just go into the future. Albert's swarm gives us that particular lesson, and I've included it in the book as something to kind of bring to light just an inkling of what we have forgotten and what would have made something unsustainable at that time frame, if not dealt with, of course.
So, as a parting message, David, what is one lesson from nature that you want every sustainability leader or business leader to internalize now and take action?
I would want to make it simply understand that if you can look at the qualitative aspect of what you're managing as a sustainability expert or professional, that will give you a more fully formed orb of the holistic approach we believe sustainability deserves. And that's what they should do.
Great. That's a great insight around the quantitative and the qualitative. So a huge thank you to David for your time, incredible insights around the difference between the locusts and also the bees and all the key insights that you've shared. If listeners wants to find more about your work and your book, can you share where they can find more of your work and your book?
I have a website, davidaugebooks.com, and my book is available on Amazon. Man's Search for Sustainability. Both of those locations would be a good place to start.
That's great. Thank you so much, David.